Some buildings are more than just brick and mortar. They are monuments to forgotten dreams. The Oak Ridge Arms was one of those places. The name itself was a cruel joke, a ghost of a promise made half a century ago. There were no oaks, just a single dying sycamore tree that clawed at the sky with skeletal branches. There were no arms offering comfort, only the grime-streaked brick facade that seemed to weep soot onto the cracked pavement below. The building stood on the frayed edge of town, a place where the city gave up and the rust began. The air here didn't smell of cut grass and opportunity. It tasted of diesel exhaust from the nearby highway, damp concrete, and the faint, sweet, sickly scent of decay that emanated from the overflowing dumpsters in the alley. This was a place of transient sounds. The constant angry hiss of traffic, the distant wail of a siren bleeding through the thin-paned windows, the rhythmic, metallic screech of the elevated train 2 blocks away. It was a soundtrack of desperation, a place where people didn't live, but merely existed, waiting for their next shift, their next check, their next disappointment. The lobby was a purgatory of peeling linoleum and water-stained ceiling tiles. The air was thick with the ghosts of 1,000 forgotten meals, stale cigarette smoke, boiled cabbage, and cheap, pine-scented cleaner that couldn't quite mask the underlying scent of mildew and misery. The single elevator was a rattling metal cage, its inspection certificate a decade out of date, its movements a groaning, shuddering prayer against gravity. To live here was to be invisible. It was to be a name on a lease, a number on a door, a problem to be managed, not a person to be known. This was the mundane hell where we find our hero. In apartment 3B, at the dark end of the hallway where the light fixture had burned out months ago, lived a man named Arthur Jensen. To the world, to the other tenants, to the landlord, Arthur was a ghost. An old man, maybe 70, maybe more. He was a slight figure, with a body that had been worn down by time and hardship, leaving behind a frame of quiet, wiry strength. He was a man of routine, of silence. You would see him in the early morning, sweeping the small patch of sidewalk in front of his door, his movements precise, economical. You would see him carrying a single meager bag of groceries, his back straight, his gaze fixed forward. His apartment, unlike the rest of the decaying building, was a sanctuary of immaculate order. It was small, sparsely furnished with items that were old, but cared for with a reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. The single wooden chair at his small table was polished to a soft sheen. The worn copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius on his nightstand had a spine that was cracked but not broken, its pages free of any dog ears. His bed was made every morning with military precision, the single wool blanket pulled taut enough to bounce a quarter, the corners folded into perfect 45-degree angles. This wasn't just tidiness, this was a ritual. It was the discipline of a man holding back the chaos of the world with nothing but his own 2 hands and an unshakable will. He was a man defined by his quiet perfectionism. He polished his own shoes, old cracked leather boots, until they held a dull, respectable shine. He hand-washed his few sets of clothes in his sink and hung them to dry on a line strung across his small bathroom, each shirt perfectly spaced, each sock pinned with its partner. He was living on the razor's edge of poverty, but you would never know it from the fierce dignity with which he maintained his person and his space. He asked for nothing. He bothered no one. He was a silent, forgotten soldier holding a lonely, forgotten post. But in a world of noise and greed, silence is often mistaken for weakness. And that is what brought the wolves to his door. The landlord of the Oak Ridge Arms was a man named Carl B. Sealer. Bessler was the physical embodiment of the building's decay. He was a large, soft man, whose cheap suit always seemed to be one size too small, the fabric straining across his ample gut. His face was perpetually flushed, a road map of broken capillaries, and he always seemed to be sweating, even on a cool day. He wore too much cheap cologne, a cloying, spicy scent that announced his presence long before you saw him and lingered long after he was gone. He walked not with the confidence of a property owner, but with the arrogant swagger of a man who enjoys the small power he holds over desperate people. His shadow was his son, Donnie. Donnie was a younger, meaner, but equally sloppy version of his father. He wore tracksuits that were stained with grease and sported a thin, patchy goatee that he seemed to be constantly stroking. Where Carl was all bluster and veiled threats, Donnie was sullen, coiled aggression. He was the muscle, the enforcer, the one who would bang on doors and intimidate old women who were a few days late on the rent. They were a matched set of petty tyrants, their authority derived entirely from the signature line on a lease agreement. They chose a Friday afternoon for their confrontation, a time when they knew most tenants would be at work, when there would be fewer witnesses. They didn't knock. They hammered on the door of 3B with the fleshy part of Carl's fist, a loud, obnoxious banging that echoed down the dark hallway. Arthur opened the door. He wasn't startled. He wasn't afraid. He simply opened the door and stood there, his posture perfect, his gaze calm and steady. He held a small, worn wooden box in his hands, and he was in the process of polishing its brass hinges with a soft, clean cloth. Carl Bessler didn't greet him. He leaned against the door frame, invading Arthur's personal space, his cheap cologne washing into the clean, simple air of the apartment. "Jensen," he began, his voice a gravelly sneer, "we got a problem. A big problem." Donnie loomed behind him, cracking his knuckles, a picture of bored menace. Arthur didn't speak. He simply waited, his clear, pale blue eyes fixed on the landlord. "The rent," Carl said, drawing the words out for maximum effect. "It's 3 months late. 3 months. Now, I run a business here, not a charity for old geezers who can't pay their way." He paused, waiting for a reaction, for a plea, an excuse, a show of fear. He got nothing. Arthur's expression didn't change. He just stood there, a silent, gray rock against which Bessler's bluster was breaking. The landlord's frustration grew. He needed to find a crack. His eyes scanned Arthur up and down, looking for a weakness to exploit. And then he saw it. Arthur's limp. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable unless you were looking for it. A slight hesitation, a fractional drag of his left leg as he shifted his weight. It was the ghost of an old, grievous wound, a story of pain and violence that he carried with him in every step. A cruel, knowing smirk spread across Carl Bessler's face. He had found his angle. "What's the matter, old man?" he sneered, pointing a fat finger at Arthur's leg. "That pension from the VA finally dry up? Or did you just spend it all on whatever booze you need to forget how you got that little gimp?" The insult was a physical blow. It was a violation far worse than the banging on the door or the threats about rent. He had taken a scar of service, a mark of sacrifice, and twisted it into a weapon of shame. In that moment, Arthur's hands, which had been gently polishing the small wooden box, tightened. The knuckles on his thin, sinewy hands turned white. A flicker of something ancient, something cold and hard as glacial ice, appeared deep in his placid blue eyes. It was there for a second, a glimpse of the warrior beneath the faded civilian shell, and then it was gone. The spring had been compressed. The first injustice, the first deep, unforgivable turn of the screw had just been delivered, and the quiet, dignified old man was taking it all in silence. Before we see how this hero silenced the room, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more true stories of courage, because you're about to witness a reckoning that was decades in the making. Carl Bessler mistook Arthur's silence for defeat. He saw the tightening of the hands, the flicker in the eyes, and he registered it as the breaking of a man's spirit. He felt a surge of victory, the cheap, intoxicating thrill of the bully. He decided to press his advantage, to grind the old man into the dust. "Look at you," he continued, his voice dripping with condescending pity. "Standing there with your little toy box. What's in there, Grandpa? Your war medals? You can't pay the rent with tin, you know." He gestured dismissively with his hand, and in doing so, his thick, clumsy fingers brushed against the wooden box Arthur was holding. It was not a hard hit, but it was enough. The box, small and smooth, slipped from Arthur's grasp. And this is when the glitch happened. A moment that defied the laws of physics and expectation. The box fell. It was a small, dark blur against the faded wallpaper of the hallway. Donnie snickered, anticipating the clatter it would make on the hard linoleum floor. Carl's sneer widened, but the box never hit the floor. Arthur moved. It wasn't the frantic, fumbling movement of an old man. It was something else entirely. As the box dropped, he didn't lunge for it. He didn't even look at it. His body seemed to react on a level far beyond conscious thought. His left leg, the one with the limp, suddenly seemed to forget its injury. It shot out, not as a kick, but as a perfectly controlled sweep. His foot, clad in the old, polished leather boot, intercepted the falling box from underneath. He didn't just kick it. He cradled it with the instep of his boot, absorbing its downward momentum with the practiced ease of a master juggler. The box was now balanced perfectly on the top of his foot. For a fraction of a second it hung there, suspended in defiance of gravity. Then, with a smooth, fluid motion that was breathtaking in its precision, he bent his knee and flipped the box upwards. It spun once in the air, a perfect, controlled rotation, and he caught it with his right hand, his fingers closing around it with a soft, final thump. The entire sequence, from the slip to the catch, took less than 2 seconds. It was a display of balance, coordination, and proprioception that would have been remarkable in a man half his age. In this quiet, limping old veteran, it was nothing short of impossible. It was the muscle memory of a body trained to an elite, almost inhuman level. It was the silent, screaming testament of a warrior. Donnie's jaw, for the first time, was not set in a sullen line. It was hanging slightly open. He had seen it, but his mind refused to process it. Carl Bessler blinked, his brainy, sluggish mind struggling to reconcile the image of the gimpy old geezer with the man who had just performed a feat of almost supernatural dexterity. But arrogance is a shield. It deflects any truth that might dent the ego. Carl chose to see it not as a sign of hidden prowess, but as a fluke. A lucky break. He forced a harsh, ugly laugh. "Whoa there, twinkle toes," he scoffed, recovering his composure. "Lucky save. Didn't know you had a career in the circus before you became a professional freeloader." He waved a thick stack of papers he had pulled from his inner jacket pocket. It was an official eviction notice. "Last chance, Jensen. You got the money or not? Because this," he shook the papers, "says you're out, on the street, where you and your little box of memories belong." He took the papers and didn't hand them to Arthur. He threw them. The white sheets scattered, one landing on the floor at Arthur's feet, a stark white flag of surrender on the worn linoleum. Arthur looked down at the paper. Then he looked back up at Carl Bessler. He didn't say a word. His silence was now something more than calm. It was vast. It was heavy. It was the silence of a deep, dark ocean, and the Besslers were just two loud, foolish men splashing around on the surface, oblivious to the crushing pressure below. And it was in that moment of ultimate, silent confrontation that a new sound entered the hallway. It was not a loud sound. It was the quiet, confident tread of expensive leather shoes on cheap, dirty linoleum. It was the subtle rustle of tailored wool. Two figures had appeared at the end of the hallway, having taken the stairs. They moved with an unnerving, synchronized purpose. They were not cops. They were not feds in windbreakers. They were something else. They were two men in dark, impeccably tailored suits that probably cost more than Arthur's rent for an entire year. They were of indeterminate age, with fit, disciplined physiques that were obvious even under the expensive fabric. They had earpieces, small and discreet, in their right ears. Their faces were utterly devoid of expression, their eyes constantly scanning, assessing, cataloging everything in the hallway. The flickering light, the peeling paint, the two cheap bullies, and the one old soldier. They moved with the quiet, terrifying efficiency of men who are accustomed to walking into hostile situations and resolving them one way or another. They were the physical embodiment of discreet, overwhelming power. As they approached, a third figure emerged from the stairwell behind them. This man was different. He was older, in his late 60s, with a mane of silver hair and a face that was lined with the heavy burden of command. He wore a simple, elegant, dark gray suit, but he carried himself with an unmistakable aura of authority. It wasn't the fake, loud authority of Carl Bessler. This was the real thing. This was the quiet, absolute confidence of a man who could move mountains with a single phone call. He walked with a slight limp, an almost perfect mirror of Arthur's own. Carl Bessler saw the suits, the earpieces, the air of money and power, and his entire demeanor changed in a heartbeat. The aggressive bully vanished, instantly replaced by a fawning, groveling sycophant. He straightened his cheap tie and plastered a greasy, welcoming smile on his face. He thought they were here for him, perhaps wealthy investors looking at the building. "Gentlemen," Carl boomed, his voice oozing false charm. "Welcome to the Oak Ridge Arms! Carl Bessler, the owner!" He extended a sweaty hand, which the older man in the gray suit completely ignored. The man's eyes, a piercing, intelligent blue, swept past Carl as if he were a piece of furniture. They scanned the hallway, took in Donnie's loutish posture, saw the eviction notice on the floor. And then they stopped. They locked onto Arthur Jensen, who was still standing silently in the doorway of apartment 3B. The air left the hallway. The distant sounds of the city seemed to fade into nothingness. The world narrowed to the space between these two old men. The man in the suit looked at Arthur, and his face, which had been a mask of stern, professional neutrality, suddenly broke. The lines of command softened. A look of profound, deeply buried emotion surfaced in his eyes, a mixture of regret, respect, and a bone-deep, sorrowful affection. He took a step forward, his expensive shoe coming to rest beside the eviction notice on the floor. He looked down at it, then back up at Arthur, and then he spoke, his voice quiet, but carrying the unmistakable resonance of command. "Arthur," he said, and the name was filled with a weight of shared history. "For God's sake, Arthur, we've been looking for you for 6 months." Carl Bessler's jaw dropped. His fake smile froze and then melted from his face, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of pure, uncomprehending shock. Donnie just stared, his knuckles forgotten, his brain completely unable to process this new reality. The man in the suit took another step forward, closing the distance. He reached out, not to shake hands, but in a gesture that was far more intimate, far more meaningful. He gently, respectfully, took the small wooden box from Arthur's hands. He held it with a reverence that bordered on awe. "I haven't seen this in 30 years, he whispered, his thumb tracing the worn grain of the wood. Not since I gone." He looked up from the box, his eyes locking with Arthur's. "They told me you were gone, Arthur. They told me you didn't make it out." Arthur Jensen finally broke his long silence. His voice was raspy from disuse, but it was steady, unbroken. "The reports were wrong, Mr. Secretary," he said. "Mr. Secretary." The words detonated in the small, filthy hallway. Carl Bessler felt his knees go weak. He stumbled back a step, his mind reeling. He was trying to connect the dots between the broke old geezer in 3B and the man being addressed as Mr. Secretary by someone who was clearly a figure of immense national importance. The Secretary of Defense turned his head slightly, his gaze falling upon Carl Bessler for the first time. It was not an angry look. It was a look of cold, analytical curiosity. The look a scientist gives a strange, unpleasant insect he has just found under a rock. "And who," the Secretary asked, his voice now devoid of all warmth, "might you be?" I'm Bessler. Carl Bessler. I own the building," he stammered, his voice cracking. The Secretary's eyes dropped again to the eviction notice on the floor. "I see," he said, the two words carrying a chilling finality. He handed the small wooden box back to one of his aides, and then turned his full, undivided attention to the terrified landlord. "For the past 30 years, the Secretary began, his voice a low, precise, and utterly devastating lecture, the United States government has had a black-funded, deeply classified program to care for certain assets. These are men who, due to the nature of their service, cannot exist in any official capacity. They have no public records, no social security numbers, no credit histories. They are ghosts. They are the men who did the jobs that we can never acknowledge, in places that we were never supposed to be." He took a step closer to Carl, who seemed to shrink under the weight of his gaze. "This man," he said, gesturing with his head towards Arthur, who stood watching, his face a calm, unreadable mask, "is not Arthur Jensen. That is merely the last name he was assigned. To the very few people who know his real story, he is known only by his call sign, Echo. He was the commander of a Massey V SOG unit that operated so far behind enemy lines, their missions were disavowed before they even began. He was a ghost long before the war was over. The limp that you so callously mocked. He got that pulling 2 of his wounded men out of a hot LZ in Cambodia, a place that officially we never were." The Secretary paused, letting the weight of his words crush Bessler. "The reason his rent is late, Mr. Bessler, is not because he is broke. It's because the secure, encrypted payment channel that my department uses to deposit his pension was compromised 6 months ago. We had to shut it down, and in the process, we lost him. We have had a Tier 1 task force, the same kind of people who hunt terrorists, searching for this man for the last 180 days, not to collect a debt, but to ensure the well-being of a national hero who we had failed." He reached into his own jacket and pulled out a sleek black satellite phone. He pressed a single button. "Get me General Counsel," he said into the phone, his eyes never leaving Bessler's terrified face. A moment passed. "Yes, it's me. I'm standing in a tenement building in—" He glanced at the peeling number on the wall. "An unnamed location. I'm looking at a fraudulent eviction notice served to a Tier 1 national asset. Yes, you heard me correctly. The landlord's name is Carl Bessler. I want you to initiate immediate legal action. Use the full weight of the Department of Justice. I want his business, his assets, his bank accounts, everything he owns, frozen by lunchtime. And I want a full-scale IRS audit of his life going back 20 years. I have a feeling a man who treats a veteran this way might have a habit of cutting corners. Yes, I'll hold. He held the phone to his ear, his cold, blue eyes locked on Carl Bessler, who was now visibly shaking, his face the color of spoiled milk. The silence in the hallway was absolute. The Secretary of Defense, one of the most powerful men on the planet, was on hold. For him. Arthur Jensen simply watched, his expression unchanged. He bent down slowly, with a quiet dignity, and picked up the eviction notice from the floor. He didn't rip it. He didn't crumple it. He simply folded it once, neatly, and held it in his hand. "That won't be necessary, Robert," Arthur said, his voice quiet but clear. The secretary looked at him, surprised. "Arthur." "The man is not worth the paperwork," Arthur stated simply. He looked at the terrified, broken landlord. "Just make him go away." The secretary held the gaze of his old friend for a long moment. He saw the weariness, the desire for peace, for silence. He nodded slowly. He spoke back into the phone. "Stand down, counsel. For now. Just have his name put on a watch list." He disconnected the call. He turned back to Arthur. "Come on, Echo," he said softly. "It's time to come in from the cold." Arthur nodded once. He turned, took one last look at the small, clean apartment that had been his sanctuary, and then walked out, falling into step beside the secretary. The two agents in suits formed a discreet perimeter around them. The two old soldiers, both limping, both survivors of a long-forgotten war, walked down the hallway and disappeared down the stairs, leaving Carl and Donnie Bessler alone in the sudden, crushing silence. They were left with nothing but the lingering scent of expensive wool, the ghost of absolute power, and the sickening, life-altering knowledge of just who they had tried to evict. In this world, we are taught to measure a man's worth by the noise he makes, by the size of his bank account, by the authority he flaunts. But true worth, true strength, is silent. It's forged in crucibles we will never see. It's carried in the hearts of quiet men who live in forgotten rooms, holding the line against the chaos. They don't ask for thanks. They don't want a parade. But they are the pillars that hold our world up. And heaven help the fool who mistakes their silence for weakness.